Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready? Ooh, I can hardly speak. I am still tired from last night's verses with the Earth, Wind, and Fire against the Isley Brothers. And if you don't know, ask your mama who her mama played while she was growing up, and then you'll know all about the Elements versus the Brothers. It was absolutely fabulous, but I am tired. Right now in the background, rather than playing music for you, I'm playing it for your mama who grew up listening to it because her mama played it. All right. This is April. It is National Poetry Month. One of these days is put a poem in your pocket, so I expect you to act accordingly for whenever that day does arrive. In the meanwhile, everyone who knows me knows that... Oh, wait a minute. I forgot the protocol. Before we begin, I must put out my arm and take my temperature because I have to be well, and I hope that you are well too. 98.2. I'm fine. I hope you are too. Okay, so as I was saying, April is National Poetry Month, and at some point this month, it's put a poem in your pocket. As you all know, Langston Hughes is my favorite poet. So, in honor of National Poetry Month, I will read one of his poems for you. Note on Commercial Theater. I will read what is written about the poem, and then I will read the poem. Hughes comments on the use of blues music in theater and adaptations of comic opera. Although best known for his poetry, Hughes also wrote several plays for the theater, including Mulatto and the lyrics for Black Nativity. Broadway is the name of the Manhattan street that gives its name to New York City's commercial theater district. Hollywood Bowl, amphitheater in Hollywood, California, used for musical performances. It is the home of the Los Angeles Philharmonic. Macbeth, play by William Shakespeare, a well-known adaptation of Macbeth, is set in Haiti, was performed at the Lafayette Theater in Harlem in 1930. Carmen Jones, a Broadway theater production adapted from George Bizet's comic opera Carmen. It premiered in 1943. Swing Mikados, an adaptation of the comic opera The Mikado by W.S. Gilbert, with the music of Sir Arthur Sullivan. The Swing Mikado was performed in New York in 1939. And so now I will read his poem, Note on Commercial Theater. You've taken my blues and gone. You sing them on Broadway, and you sing them in Hollywood Bowl, and you mix them up with symphonies, and you fix them, and they don't sound like me. Yep, you done taken my blues and gone. You also took my spirituals and gone. You put me in Macbeth and Carmen Jones and all kinds of swing Mikados, and then everything but what's about me. But someday, somebody'll stand up and talk about me and write about me. Black is beautiful, and sing about me and put on plays about me. I'll reckon it'll be me myself. Yes, it'll be me. Langston, not Langston. Yep, Langston Hughes. And this is poetry for Langston Hughes. Edited by David Russell and Arnold Rampersad. Illustrated by Benny Andrews. And so, because he described a really cool existence where somebody was going to write about him and how wonderful he is in all his blackness, I decided to read What a Truly Cool World by Julius Lester and Joseph Pater. In the meanwhile, because I haven't had anything yet, and I just decided I wanted some peach tea, I'm a bit parched. I hope that I've let it brew enough. Okay, so the spoon is stuck. You look at the cover while I maneuver this mess I just created. There we are. Good job. And I'll take a sip of tea. Oh, that peach tea is heavenly. It really is a truly cool world to have delicious tea. Oh, that's good. Okay. What a truly cool world. I'll read the end flap for you. I think that when you have a little preview, it keeps you engaged. Once, God created the world, but Shaniqua, the angel in charge of everybody's business, thought it looked dull. So, God got to work creating again. Improving the world wasn't as easy as he thought. Luckily, he had help from his wife, Irene God, his secretary, Bruce, and of course, Shaniqua. But that was only the beginning. In this hilarious fractured creation story, the truly amazing team of Julius Lester and Joseph Pater imagine a world so truly cool, readers of all ages will feel privileged to live there. What a truly cool world. Well, you hear Steve out back there cutting up. I should have known. You know he'd be acting up sometime. Okay, all of the time. Oh, that tea is good. What a Truly Cool World by Julius Lester, illustrated by Joseph Pater. Here we go. To Claudia Menza, my friend, J.L., that's the author. For David and Dina, J.C., that's the illustrator. I am not going to read all of this. Even with my glasses, it is too tiny. Go buy the book. Go borrow the book. Go freeze frame this and read it for yourself. But I'm not going to read that right now. Let's get started. When God finished making the world, he felt as bright as sunny as love. He felt as bright and sunny as love. He had never made a world before, and if he said so himself, and he did, he thought he had done a very good job. God looked at the round ball of green and blue and brown suspended in the darkness of space. The green was the trees. The blue was water, and the brown was land. People were down there too. Black, white, yellow, and red ones, and animals, horned, clawed, winged, and furry. God smiled and decided to go home and get ready for bed. Just then, Shaniqua, the angel in charge of everybody's business, came bursting through the door of the throne room. "God, what you call that down there?" she wanted to know, pointing out the window. "That's the earth. It's pretty, ain't it?" Shaniqua looked at God like he was blind in one eye and deaf in the other. Don't look like much to me. I don't want to hurt your feelings or nothing like that, but what you made looks kind of boring. God narrowed his eyes and stared at the world again. "You're right, Shaniqua," he admitted reluctantly. "I know I'm right. I'm always right." The next morning, God got up ready to do some more creating, but he didn't know what. When he walked into the throne room, the Hallelujah angelic choir of 16 trillion voices started chanting like it had done every morning for the past 11 trillion years. God, he's our man. If he can't do it, nobody can. That's true, God thought. I am the man. "Bruce," he called out. Bruce was God's secretary. He was standing in the corner, brushing his wings. "Yo, what's up, deity?" he asked, hurrying over to God. "Bring me a pair of scissors." Bruce had no idea what scissors were since they hadn't been invented yet. He flew off to the library of everything that is going to be and typed "scissors" on a computer. Next thing he knew, he was holding 2 long, sharp pieces of metal joined in the middle. "Awesome!" proclaimed. "Awesome!" Bruce proclaimed. He flew back to the throne room. "Here you go, mighty one." He leaned out the window, his arms stretching until they reached. God leaned out the window, his arms stretching until they reached earth, and he began clipping the trees. Tiny green pieces of leaves floated down to the ground, and that was how grass and bushes came to be. "That's better," God declared. "Now, the world isn't so brown. That ought to satisfy Shaniqua." God wasn't finished being pleased with himself more before Shaniqua charged into the throne room. "How's that?" God asked proudly. Shaniqua was not impressed. "Blue, green, and brown. Is that the best you can come up with?" God sighed and looked at the world again. Shaniqua was right. Everything still looked drab. What was he going to do? The next morning, God woke up with an idea, but he wasn't sure it would work. He skipped breakfast and headed toward the edge of heaven. "What's up, mighty maker?" Bruce asked, flying alongside God. "You'll see. Where's Shaniqua?" "Right behind you, God." The angels sensed something big was going to happen. By the time God arrived, they were sitting on the clouds, waiting. They had brought picnic baskets and coolers filled with lemonade, and they were eager to see what God was going to do. God stepped to the edge, cleared his throat, and and out came the most beautiful sound the angels had ever heard. Oh, let's see what it was. What's that? Shaniqua wanted to know. Why, that's music, Bruce exclaimed. He had been reading about it in the library of everything that is going to be. That's music, he repeated in wonder. God's singing was like a choir of 6 million voices, high voices, low voices, voices ringing, singing notes only dogs heard, and voices singing low, singing notes only the whales in the deepest part of the ocean heard. As the notes came out of God's mouth, they took shape and became circles and squares and spirals and trapezoids and rhombuses and triangles. The shaped notes floated through space and down to earth, and when they touched the ground, they turned into colors, reds and blues and purples and yellows and pinks. What's all them colors? An angel asked Bruce and pointed down at the earth. Let me take a sip. Oh, that tea is so good. Y'all hear the Isley brothers, right? Mm-hmm. Enough said. Bruce shook his head slowly in amazement. Oh, wait a minute now. Wait a minute. Yeah. Bruce shook his head slowly in amazement. Those are flowers. Flowers, the angels repeated in hushed whispers. Shaniqua couldn't believe what she was hearing and seeing. Go on with your bad self, God, she laughed with delight. As the notes sprinkled onto the ground, they bloomed, and each said its name, and as the names and their names were like music. Daffodil, sunflower, chicory, amaranth. Let me hear you say that. Amaranth. That's almost as pretty as God singing, isn't it? Chamomile, gardenia, baby's breath. Close to evening, God stopped and looked at Shaniqua. Give me 5, he said to her, holding out his hand. She slapped it hard. You are truly cool, God. Truly. That night, when God went to sleep, he slept soundly. Finally, he was done creating the world. The next morning, God didn't have one eye open before he heard whispering. It's lonely down here. It was the flowers. I know we were put here to make the world beautiful, but we're lonely. God couldn't believe his ears. Maybe creating a world had been a big mistake. He was probably going to hear nothing but complaints from now until. Bruce! God called in a voice so loud that heaven shook. Bruce had been trying to explain to his wife why he hadn't brought her any flowers yesterday when he heard God's voice. Oops, gotta go to himself. He's not in a good mood today. Don't wait dinner. He put on his wings and was out of the window. When Bruce reached God's house, the Almighty was sitting on the porch drinking coffee with his wife, Irene God. Bruce had always wondered what God's first name was, but he had never had the nerve to ask it. Good morning, terrific Titan. Ain't nothing good about it. What's the problem? It's them flowers I made yesterday. They're lonely. Well, sing something into creation to keep them company, Bruce said, and underneath he added, George. My voice is hoarse from all that singing I did yesterday. And what did you just call me? God asked, getting angry. Nothing, Fearless Fixer, nothing. This is not the morning to mess with me. Yes, sir. Where's Shaniqua? She liked your singing so much that she's at home trying to teach herself to sing. How does she sound? Well, to tell the truth, almost as good as you. God smiled. Go get her. I want to hear this for myself. A few minutes later, Bruce returned with Shaniqua. She had never been to God's house or met his wife, and she was as proper as a little girl playing grown-up. Bruce says you can sing almost as good as me, God said. Shaniqua blushed and shook her head. No, sir. I just be singing around the house. That's all. Singing to myself, really. Well, let me hear you. Shaniqua opened her mouth. The sound that came from her throat, was as soft and smooth as a flower's breath. As quiet as it was, it could be heard all over heaven. The angels stopped what they were doing to listen. The sound was so beautiful that water began to flow from their eyes. And that is how tears came into creation. The music went out into the universe. The stars and the planets had never heard anything so beautiful. Tiny pieces started falling off of them. These were their tears. The pieces floated down through space until they reached Earth. People looked up at the tiny scraps fluttering around. The yellow ones were the sun's tears. The blue ones were the tears from the moon. The white ones were the star tears, while the red ones were from Mars, and the orange one from Venus. What are they? People wanted to know. Flutterbys, somebody called them. The air was filled with flashing colors as the flutterbys flew, here and there, visiting and kissing each other. Look what you done, God said to Shaniqua. You created flutterbys. Wrong, said Bruce. That silly word is never going to exist. Well, what are they? God wanted to know. Shaniqua smiled. I know. The people are a little confused. What they mean to say are butterflies. Ain't that pretty, Irene? Mrs. God agreed that it was. So did God. So did the people on earth. They held out their arms, and the butterflies covered them and their entire bodies until each person was wearing a suit of butterflies. Give me 5, Shaniqua said to God. He shook his head. I couldn't have made the world without you, Shaniqua. And God gave her a big hug. What a truly cool world, God. Truly. What a truly cool book, y'all. But you know what I always tell you at the end of each story? Go take your nap.